Question: how do we know what we know? So now that we're covering John Locke, you might notice that I changed the question a little bit. There's actually a couple of reasons for this. Locke is sort of tough to pin down a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look first at his definition of knowledge. He's pretty clear on that. And then I'll tell you why I had to sort of rephrase the question as, how do we know what we know? So here it is from his essay concerning human understanding. Knowledge then seems to me to be nothing but the perception of the connection and agreement or disagreement and repugnancy of any of our ideas. In this alone it consists. Where this perception is, there is knowledge, and where it is not, there though we may fancy, guess, or believe, yet we always come short of knowledge. So Locke is laying down his definition pretty clearly, or at least he thinks it's clear. Once we think about this for a little bit, it's not entirely clear we know what he means. So let's summarize it this way. For Locke, knowledge is the perception of agreement of ideas. Now that is a fair summary of the preceding little paragraph, but how are we supposed to interpret this? Agreement of ideas with what? With other ideas? Or with reality itself? It's actually contentious, and there's actually many interpretations, unfortunately, and I'm not going to cover them. I'm going to cover one pretty mainstream one. It isn't the only mainstream one, but it is the one we're going to go with. And I think this one, well, first of all, I think it's correct, but other Lockean scholars might say otherwise. But the second reason why I think we're going to cover this one, or it's a good idea to cover this one, is because it really kind of shows the points of contention with the so-called rival camp, the rationalists. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame Locke's view in contrast. Where are they? There they are. In contrast with the opposing camp. So on the left we have the empiricists. Up top left is Berkeley. At the bottom it's David Hume. And on the right of the blue camp is John Locke. And on the red corner we have up on the top right Spinoza, then Leibniz at the bottom, and of course our old friend Descartes on the left. So even though I mentioned already that this is a contentious division into two camps, in fact the empiricist camp is just constantly attacking each other, so they're really not unified at all, but it is kind of a useful distinction to make, even if it isn't a very formal one. So here's what we can do. We're going to go ahead and set off Locke's views against Descartes' views, and I think that'll give you kind of a better glimpse as to how Locke really thinks. Okay. First of all, the rationalists in general were very comfortable and, in fact, sort of needed innate ideas in their theories. Well, Locke doesn't believe in innate ideas that you are born with. And so he's going to give us an argument against innate ideas from the slides. If humans really had innate ideas, for example, our idea of self, of perfection, of God, of logical principles, etc., then young children would understand them. Children, however, don't show any comprehension whatsoever of these particular ideas. They must be taught. Therefore, humans aren't born with innate ideas. This is a simple and straightforward modus tollens, so it is valid. What we must do now is check if it is sound. Let's focus here on premise number 2. Children don't show any comprehension of these particular ideas. Well, if you've been in contact with small children ever, you'll know that they don't know much of anything. They'll try anything at least once, including things that will hurt them. I've heard of kids who run into the street without knowing any better, who put their hands on hot stoves. I personally know one now grown-up person who, as a child, put a hot iron to her mouth. Don't worry, she is not permanently disfigured or anything, but this is a story that she told me, and it's kind of baffling that kids would not have an instinct or something to not do these things, but they don't. They just kind of try everything and see what happens, right? So that's the first thing we have to note about children. It's not clear that they know much of anything. They must be taught. That's pretty obvious, actually. They must be taught. So if they don't know even those simple things, what makes you think they have an idea of self or of perfection or of God? I actually have heard horror stories, pretty much, of people that are trying to teach, I guess you would call it catechism, or the basic ideas of Catholicism to young people, to children, and they usually have kind of some of the funniest questions for the catechism teachers. They'll ask questions like, can God handle really spicy food? They don't have any notion of God whatsoever. This is sort of a question that arises in their head. More to the point, I suppose, is our idea of perfection. I'm not even sure that right now I have an idea of perfection. I sort of can imagine what a perfect thing might be, but there's a difference between imagining perfection and actually thinking about perfection. Even for the case of ourselves, as we get older, we kind of discover more and more about ourselves. And it certainly wasn't the case that we were born knowing this about ourselves. We have to kind of learn as we go. So Locke here is saying, look, children don't know any of these things that you say, Descartes, that they know through innate ideas. Your whole theory is wrong. Humans aren't born with innate ideas. That's the basic argument. And although I won't give a foundationalist response to this now, for the moment we can notice this is at least something they have to respond to. This is, after all, a valid argument, and it seems sound. So, something to think about. He then makes clear that just because something is self-evident or is universally agreed to, that doesn't mean that it's innate. So he wants to go a little further even and say, look, some things, it might be the case that everyone agrees to, that still doesn't make it so that we were born knowing them already. It could be something that we simply all learned. It's not even the case that there are innate ideas of moral, which he calls practical matters, either. So here he is quoting him, it will be hard to find any moral rule that has as much claim to immediate universal assent as does a logical principle. What he's trying to say is, if you look far enough, you're going to realize that even moral matters aren't universal. Things that you might think are universally subscribed to moral values, they're actually not. So this actually brings us to, the cognitive bias of the day. This one is the false consensus bias, the tendency to see one's own behavioral choices and judgments as relatively common and appropriate to existing circumstances. We, of course, tend to believe that whatever view we have, a lot of people have that. It's surprising to us, for example, if a conversation ever comes up to you on whether or not spanking children is okay, if you do think spanking children is okay, you're more likely to think a lot of people think spanking their children is okay. People are surprised when I say I think you shouldn't ever spank your children. So people typically think that whatever they hold, that's what other people hold as their views as well. Same thing with something like capital punishment. This doesn't come up in conversation often, but when it does, people tend to assume, most people think, let's just say you disagree with capital punishment. Most people say, well, other people must disagree with capital punishment too. We kind of tend to, at least for our in-group, we tend to project our beliefs onto them. And that's not accurate at all. So Locke isn't quite saying this. Locke is instead saying, even if everyone agreed to some moral norm, that wouldn't make it innate. So I have here a little Lockean checklist that will help us keep track of what we've covered. And it's definitely the case that Locke rejects innate ideas. He also conflicts with Descartes on perception. So I will take this from the slides. Whereas Descartes did not think the senses were reliable enough to yield foundational beliefs, Locke believes that sensory perception is in general a truth-conducive or reliable process. Reliabilism is the view that a subject knows a proposition if it was acquired through a reliable process, like perception. So that's definitely another thing they don't agree on. You can kind of see that there's a definite rift going on here. Okay, simple and complex ideas. In Book 2, Locke lays out his view on how we come to know things. Quote, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge?" To this I answer in one word, from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. This thesis has come to be known as Locke's blank slate hypothesis, the view that the mind is born without any knowledge. His assertion that all knowledge comes from sensory experience, in other words, from the senses, is what makes him an empiricist. Now, this is an important point. Clearly, he's been put in this empiricist camp, and yes, the empiricists do battle with each other, but there is something really important here about the belief that the senses are the foundation of knowledge as opposed to reason, which is the Cartesian point of view. So let's linger on this for a second. How do we acquire our ideas, right? Our perceptions of the world? Well, they come in two forms, but it all starts with simple ideas. So here's the definition of a simple idea. Simple ideas are passively received by the mind and have no other ideas as parts. These ideas perfectly represent the external world. These are, I like to think about them as atomic. They can't be subdivided. They are simply just the most basic perceptions you might have. So anyone that knows me knows I am a bit of a caffeine addict. Some people think I shouldn't drink as much coffee as I do. These people are called doctors. In any case, I still drink plenty of caffeine. And currently, literally this moment, I am enjoying one of my favorite brews, the Highland Grog from Bones Coffee. And let me tell you about this brew. I think it is definitely one of my favorite brews. I'll say that much. It's a medium roast, so it has a light body feel to it. It feels light on the tongue. The forward flavor of this particular brew is butterscotch. You can kind of taste the butterscotch throughout. It's maybe the strongest flavor. But there is also a softer, milder layer of two things. Of kind of a spiced rum, I'd say. And there's also a pretty, also I would say kind of in the middle between the subtle spiced rum and the strong butterscotch, there's a pretty consistent maple flavor in there too. It is absolutely beautiful, I think. And everything that I just said right now, those would all be simple ideas. So just think about this for a second. Can you break up caramel flavor any further? I don't think so. I mean, it just like if someone asks you, "Hey, what does caramel taste like?" What tastes like caramel, man? So you can't really break these up anymore. Butterscotch. How are you going to describe that? It tastes like butterscotch. So these are, in a sense, atomic. And these are examples of simple ideas. A light mouthfeel, the feel of velvet. So I put some of these in here so you can kind of tell. And out of these simple ideas, you build more complex ideas. Complex ideas are ideas produced by the mind operating on ideas that are somehow already in the mind, whether simple or complex. These are not as accurate as simple ideas in representing the external world. But Locke says they're still pretty reliable. Not perfect, but reliable. So I know you can do this. Throughout your life, you've somehow acquired the simple idea of redness. You've also acquired the simple idea of sweetness. And let's put these two together plus a couple of other things. And you know that once you put these simple ideas together, you'll get the complex idea that you have of an apple. So there's something that sort of all apples kind of have in common. It's not really their shape or their size, but there's all these other simple ideas that they kind of do match a little bit. So that's a complex idea, an apple. You can do this with complex ideas too. You can combine already complex ideas to make even more complex ideas. So I know you have the notion of a horse. You've seen plenty of horses, and you know that's a thing. You also know the complex idea of a shark, a great white shark. And I know that you can combine these in your head. Go ahead, try it. Did you think of something like this? That's a complex idea. You took two complex ideas and combined them. If you want a close-up, here it is. That is, first of all, that's frightening, but that is definitely something that our mind can do. And Locke is sort of onto something in that maybe this is how we kind of work things out. We have categories and we kind of blend them together with our mind's eye. So that's an interesting insight. That's how he thinks. Let me get rid of this. That's how he thinks you build up your ideas of the world. So out of complex ideas, you form more and more complex ideas and categories of ideas like hoarseness. Hoarseness, of course, you have a bunch of simpler ideas and you put them together to make hoarseness, whatever all horses have in common. But, this is extremely important, it all starts with our simple ideas. They are the atomic building blocks. Interestingly, by the way, I'll mention this very briefly, reflection. What is reflection on Locke's view? Well, it's actually simple ideas of sort of the inner workings of our mind. The mental operations that we have going on all the time, we can sometimes perceive them. That's what reflection is. Kind of a cool idea. Okay. So there it is. We knocked out simple and complex ideas. I must stress that simple ideas perfectly match reality or represent it. Complex ideas don't perfectly represent reality, but they are built up of simple ideas, and there must be copying errors along the way, and that's what makes them there's less fidelity to them, let's say. Okay, we're going to get to the main point about confidence in a second. Let's put everything together so far into this view. Indirect realism is the view that all we ever perceive is our own ideas, not the external world. Our ideas, however, are similar to the external world. So now I'm using this word similar because our ideas of the external world, of course, are not just simple ideas, but they're also complex. And because of the complex ideas, we can't say that they perfectly match, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say similar when I mean that, sure, there are some simple ideas that do match the world perfectly, but in general, our worldviews are made out of complex ideas, and those aren't as strictly representative of the external world. So let me give you an example of this and kind of feel what this theory feels like. Let's take the example of Homer Simpson. By the way, I use a lot of Simpson cartoons for someone who doesn't watch The Simpsons. But anyway, let's just say Homer is enjoying a beer there apparently. And he looks at some carrot cake. Maybe when he has a couple of beers, he gets a sweet tooth. So in any case, he isn't, on Locke's view, he isn't really seeing the carrot cake. He is, in a way, locked inside his head. We all are, in a way, locked inside of our heads. And the only access we have to the external world is through our sensory perception, our eyes, our ears, etc. They take information from the external world, process it for us, and then give it to our mind. And of course, Locke didn't use very modern language of the science of perception or anything, but this is basically what he's saying. And by the way, it's basically accurate. And so on Locke's view, all we ever really perceive is, he calls it our idea of the carrot cake. We can call it our representation of the carrot cake, whatever you're comfortable with. The thing that you want to make sure you understand is that the external world is one thing, and our internal world is entirely separate from that. Our internal world is just the product that our sensory systems give to us to perceive. So that's an important point. I'm going to go ahead and stress that now. There is, of course, the internal world and the external world. And yes, our sensory mechanisms receive the external world and process it and give it to us, but there is still an unbridgeable chasm between our internal world and the external world. We can never check that our ideas really match the external world. So, why should we trust that they do? Well, the general argument is that if our internal ideas didn't match the external world well enough, we would have died by now. If you have erroneous beliefs, you're not going to make it very long. Especially erroneous beliefs about simple things like whether or not you're looking at carrot cake. So that's why Locke believes our senses are pretty darn reliable. In fact, we have not died yet because of them. So that's the general argument. But again, you can never really check them. So in sum, perfect knowledge of the world is not possible. This whole rationalist goal, it's just not going to happen, because no one person can interact with all the things in the universe to produce an idea of those things. First of all, that's completely impractical and impossible. And even if they did, knowledge of complex things is not perfect. So that's what's going on here. That's a very clear difference between Descartes and Locke. Descartes thinks you can bring deductive certainty, the deductive certainty of mathematics, to the external world. And Locke is saying, that is just not possible. Lastly, faith or opinion, which are lumped in the non-knowledge camp, is acceptance of something as true when we are not reasonably assured that it is true. We might tell ourselves and insist that it's true, but unless we have the ideas to back it up, we are not reasonably assured that it is true. We have to watch out for this. In Locke's time, as in Descartes' time, so Locke came a little bit after Descartes, but during both their time periods, things were going on that were just horrifying to them. You know, the 30 Years' War had finished. few decades before Locke was writing this, but it was still fresh in their memories, and they wanted to move away from blind faith or dogmatism. So here is how Locke is trying to move away from that. If you're not reasonably assured, then you can't call it knowledge. And he gives you his recipe for how you're reasonably assured. You build up your simple and complex ideas. So I'll close with this here quote by John Locke, which I think is actually a beautiful line. And I think it kind of encapsulates his approach to knowledge. If I succeed, that may have the effect of persuading the busy mind of man to be more cautious in meddling with things that are beyond its power to understand, to stop when it is at the extreme end of its tether, and to be peacefully reconciled to ignorance of things that turn out to be beyond the reach of our capacities. Perhaps then we shall stop pretending that we know everything. If we can find out what the scope of the understanding is, how far it is able to achieve certainty, and in what cases it can only judge and guess, that may teach us to accept our limitations and to rest content with knowing only what our human condition enables us to know.